Some years ago, when I was doing some local history research, I came across a facsimile of Alexander George Reed's book, Annals of Auchterarder and Memorials of Strathearn, published in 1899. It was in this book that I found a chapter intriguingly titled The Terrible Parish. There is a country song about the parish in question. Reed tells us, Little Dunkeld was commonly held to be the terrible parish in Scotland referred to in the old rhyme, but the real locality is that of the parish of Kinkell in Strathearn, the mistaken identity having arisen in the similarity of names. The lines are as follows. Was there e'er a parish, a parish, a parish? Was there e'er a parish as that of Kinkell? They've hangit the minister, droon the precentor, dang doon the steeple, and drucken the bell. The explanation given of the circumstances which gave rise to the rhyme is that the minister had been hanged, the precentor drowned in attempting to cross the Erne from the adjoining parish of Trinity Gask, the steeple had been taken down, and that the bell had been sold to the parish of Cockpen, near Edinburgh. Reed relates that the minister in question was Mr. Richard Duncan, who had his degree from the University of Edinburgh on the 2nd of July 1667, was licensed by the bishop of that diocese on the 10th of April 1673, and ordained minister of Kinkell between the 16th of September and the 11th of November 1674. For the first few years everything appears to have gone well, but then Mr. Duncan got himself into difficulties over the maintenance of the church along with that of Trinity Gask. Both required rebuilding, but some of those required to contribute towards the cost were failing to do so. Meanwhile, Mr. Duncan complained to the synod that some ash trees growing in the churchyard had been cut down and the wood sold to pay for a new bell without his agreement. At a subsequent synod meeting in 1681, the elders of the church seem to have got their own back by making complaints against Mr. Duncan, representing his gross ignorance in rebaptising a child and other gross, rude and scandalous offences and misdemeanours. It ended with his being deposed from his position, but much worse was to come. On the 6th of June 1682, Mr. Duncan was found guilty of murdering his own illegitimate child by a servant girl named Catherine Stalker, and condemned to death. The baby's body had been found buried under the hearthstone in his house. It is said that a last-minute reprieve was obtained, but the messenger arrived 20 minutes too late. The minister had been hanged. The story goes that Mr. Duncan declared his innocence right up to the end and said that as proof of it, after his execution, a white dove would land on the gallows, and this accordingly took place. The other disasters listed in the song are also supposed to have really taken place. The minister who officiated at Trinity Gask also had to appear at Kinkell every other week, and it was on one such occasion that the precentor drowned while crossing the River Erne. Meanwhile, the church at Kinkell remained in a ruinous state for some time after Mr. Duncan's death. Eventually it was rebuilt, but without the steeple, which was presumably demolished when the ruins were levelled for the rebuilding. Reed says that the church bell was cast on the continent in 1680 for the parish of Kinkell, but was removed to Cockpen by 1708. It was first hung in the old parish church of Cockpen, later ruined, and then moved to the new church about a mile away in 1820. In Reed's time, at least, it was still in use there.
We're going to sing a song here now, which is actually a song of what brought Helen and I together, actually, at one point. Helen's going to... I'm not going to explain this song. Helen's going to explain this song, but she did a lot of research and put to bed a little mystery. We used to sing this song as the parish of Dunkeld, and it's actually the parish of Kinkell, which is very close by here. So we're just going to sing this song. Listen to the words. Have a wee thing about it. It's about the terrible parish, terrible people doing terrible things in the parish, and Helen's going to refer to this when she's talking next. So.
The terrible thing about drinking with your neighbours.
Drinking with your neighbours. Oh, what a parish, a terrible parish. Oh, what a parish is that o' Kinkell. They hang at their minister, drunt their precentor, dang down the steeple and fuddle the bell.
Steeple was doomed, but the kirk was still standing. The bigot along where the bell used to hang. Still pot they got in the brewing Highland whiskey. Sundays they drank it and round it and sang.
Oh, had you but seen how graceful it looked, crammed in the pews, socially joined. MacDonald the piper struck up in the pulpit. He made the pipes skirl with the music divine. When drink freed their care, that curse and they'd swear, they ranted and sang what you dare no well tell. But Geordie and Charlie, they bothered full rarely. With whiskey they're worse than the devil himself. When the heart-cheering spirit had mounted their garret to a ball on the green, they all did adjourn. Maids with coats kilted, they step it and lilt it. When tired or dry to the kirk, they'd return. If the kirks all o'er Scotland held such social gatherings, no warning you'd need frae a far tinkling bell. For kindness and friendship would draw them together, far better than roaring the horrors of hell. Oh, what a parish, a terrible parish. Oh, what a parish is that o' Kinkell. They hang at their minister, drunt their precentor, dang down the steeple and fuddle the bell. But let me advise you what mischief there lies when neighbours are drinking with more than themselves. Of your heart and your hand try to keep some command, or you'll end up as bad as the folk o' Kinkell. We don't want that.
My name is Helen Grant. I live in Crieff, and I write what Paul Gorman of Horrified magazine described as Perthshire Gothic. My story, The Dove, is based on true-life local events. In 1682, Richard Duncan, the minister of St. Bean's in Kinkell Bridge, was hanged for the infanticide of his own child. He maintained his innocence to the end, saying that as proof of it, a white dove would fly down and land on the scaffold after his death. And this is said to have actually happened. One aspect of this story has been changed. Having read extensively all about the case, I am not convinced of the Reverend Duncan's guilt. So I've changed the name of the minister in the story to James Denson, not wanting, perhaps, to hang an innocent man all over again. The Dove. Tradition has it that Mr. Denson, when led to the gallows, avowed his innocence of the crime, declaring that after his being thrown off, a white dove would fly down and land on the scaffold as proof of it. It is said that this really did happen. Who, thought Freya, tries to prove their innocence like that? And how can it possibly have taken place? She'd meandered a long way from the original track of her research. Still, who could resist a story like this one, of murder, of retribution, and supernatural signs? The more she pored over it, the more she thought she could see through the smooth prose to something far more brutal hidden within. Imagine, she thought, James Denson, a man not yet 30, recently licensed by his bishop, becomes the minister of a small Highland parish. For some years things go well. There is not a murmur against him. He is, no doubt, a familiar figure in his sober clergyman's clothing as he rides around the muddy roads or ducks under the lintel of a rough cottage. But then the accusations begin. Drunkenness early in the day, language unsuited to a man of the cloth, lewdness, brawling. Finally, even the word witchcraft is whispered. The congregation are loud in their protestations. The bishop, outraged, removes the Reverend Denson from his post. And now the true horror begins. The disgraced minister having been flung out of the manse, workmen are sent into the house to repair the damage caused by violence and neglect. Even the hearthstone does not sit firmly in its place. They lever it up, meaning to reposition it. Underneath it, curled in the damp black earth like a pallid comma, they find the rotting remains of a tiny baby. Appalling enough to kill an infant, worse to murder your own child, as the Reverend Denson has done. The mother is soon found, his servant girl Margaret, a wretched, cowed thing, probably an unwilling partner in his unholy rutting. History does not record what happened to her, but James Denson is tried before the Earl, and soon after he is taken to the gallows and hanged, not before claiming that a white dove will land on the scaffold afterwards to prove his innocence, not that he will live to see the truth or otherwise of this. A nasty, brutish tale. In spite of the odd little codicil about the dove, Freya might have put it out of her mind. Infanticide was a depressingly common crime in the 17th century. Still, the more she looked into it, the more she could see that there could easily be another side to this story. The Reverend Denson's relationship with his parishioners, for example, that had started to go bad before the accusations were thrown around. He had inherited a parish church in a tumble-down state, and those who were responsible for contributing to the restoration of it were reluctant to pay up. The Reverend had pursued them energetically. Had he made the parish too hot to hold him? Am I reading too much into this, she thought. Perhaps the story should be taken at face value. The corpse of a baby had been found under the man's hearthstone, after all. What could be more damning than that? A person must be a brute if he can sit of an evening warming his hands over the fire and know that under the stone upon which his buckled shoe rests is the mouldering body of his own child. Freya shuddered. And yet, in cases of that kind, hadn't it usually been the mother who'd been prosecuted? Margaret, the servant girl, would have had much more to lose than the Reverend Denson did. He could have denied paternity, thrown her out into the street. There was no DNA testing in those days. It would have been the word of a servant against that of a minister. If she, Freya, had been the investigating officer in this crime, she would have made Margaret the lead suspect. James Denson might have been guilty of the sin of lust, but that didn't necessarily make him a murderer. Freya half expected to wake up the next morning and realise that her imagination had run away with her. Mostly, what you saw was what you got. History said the Reverend Denson had killed a baby and been hanged for it, and that was probably what had happened. The story was still there at the back of her mind, though. Had justice been administered on the gallows, or had it, too, been murdered? Supposing that happened to me, she thought, being condemned for something I didn't do. Of course, that was ridiculous because nobody was hanged anymore in Scotland. But still, the idea of it. Wouldn't it make a difference to me if just one person, just one, believed I was innocent? She thought it would. To think of standing there on the scaffold, shivering in just your shirt and smelling the stink of a 17th century market town, the animals, the rubbish on the street, the unwashed bodies pressing close as people strained to see the execution, and then looking up and seeing one person looking at you with pity, perhaps even with love. That would be something to hold on to when they pushed you off and the rope tightened around your neck, killing you instantly if you were lucky, but more likely giving you 10 minutes of agony as your legs kicked uselessly in the cold air. Then there was the anecdote about the Reverend Denson foretelling the white dove. He must have been desperate to prove his innocence to do that, thought Freya. He must have known the chances of it happening were practically nil. Perhaps he just wanted one last faint try at proving that he wasn't guilty. And it had happened, if you believe the eyewitnesses. A white dove really had flown down and landed on the scaffold. Common sense asserted itself. Perhaps the condemned man had seen the bird perched on a nearby building and taken a gamble. Or perhaps he had said nothing about a white dove at all, but the bird had flown down to land on the scaffold anyway, and someone else had created an affecting story out of it. Or maybe, she thought, he really was innocent and that proved it. I want to know, one way or another. Freya read the account again. Now she saw that although those who had been so reluctant to pay for the rebuilding of the church had had their way for a while, eventually it had been done. If they had framed the unpopular minister, they'd done it in vain. It was then that she began to wonder whether the church still stood. The only reason she found the church was that she knew that it was there to be found. The site was screened by trees, and there was nothing to see from the road. She picked her way across rough grass wreathed with brambles and found a rusting gate between mossy stone pillars. Freya looked inside, and her heart sank. She'd known it was ruined, but she'd hoped for something more than this. The church that had stood here wasn't really James Denson's church. It had been rebuilt years after his death. But it was on the same site, and she'd imagined herself standing on the spot where he had stood centuries before, the open sky above the naked stone walls simply bringing the destructive work of passing time more poignantly to mind. The place didn't even look like a church. Whatever remained was buried under a profusion of overgrown vegetation, the ends hanging down to meet the unkempt grass. A triangular piece of stonework reared up at the east end, but that was overshadowed by a tree that had taken root and grown to a height in the ruins. Freya went closer, threading her way between lichenous tombstones. Inside, the space was more cramped than she had expected, dim in the shadow of the clustering foliage overhead. Bushes thrust up through the rubble on the floor. Ivy snaked everywhere, binding the tumbled stones together. What did you expect, she chided herself? The ghost of James Denson? All the same, she was disappointed. She squeezed her way back out. What now? It should have been the end of the matter, but Freya was strangely reluctant to let it go. She lingered in the churchyard, gazing east over the gravestones at the distant river, turned to liquid fire by the sinking sun. Freya imagined James Denson standing here, his clerical robes flapping in the autumn wind, his breath visible on the chill air, his grey eyes perhaps turned in the same direction hers now were. It was a short step from that to wondering where he had gone after visits to the church. Where was the manse? She hadn't thought of looking for the house until this moment, so there was absolutely nothing to guide her. All the same, she was moving before she was aware of it, making her way to the south side of the churchyard with the conviction of foreknowledge. There was a crumbling wall here, and on the other side grass, then trees rooted in brambles and weeds. Freya scaled the wall easily. The sun was very low now. She was excited and terrified in equal measure. If she went home now, she wouldn't bring herself to this point again. I know it's here. And it was. Freya went to the spot as unerringly as if someone had led her there. The house was as dilapidated as the church had been. The dank green of the moss that covered the stones blurred easily into the deep shadows of the overhanging trees. The door had gone, The lintel stone lay on the ground. Freya stepped over it, into the enclosure within. She saw that the stump of the chimney, though ruinous, still stood like a grave marker over the hearth fire that had burnt out forever. Freya squatted in front of it. "What are you looking for?" she asked herself. "You think the hearthstone's still going to be here when half the chimney's fallen down?" All the time she was thinking about it, her fingers were brushing stones aside, closing on the larger ones, tossing them away into the rubble at the side of the room. "What are you going to do if you find a flat stone under here? Pry it up?" Of course not. But her palms were already smoothing dust and tiny chips of stone from a broad, flat surface. Her fingertips were questing for the edges. She found the corners easily, but she could tell the stone was heavy. Freya put one knee on the ground, wincing as the rough edges of stones pressed into her flesh. She grasped the edge of the hearthstone and pulled, the muscles in her back flexing ominously. Somewhere deep down inside her, lost at the bottom of a dark well, a voice was screaming, "What are you doing? No, don't!" But she continued to pull, leaning back now to use all of her weight, and the edge of the stone was rising ponderously. The strain in her arms and shoulders was terrific. Her fingertips, now hooked firmly over the stone, could feel the cold, slick underside of it. Her nostrils were full of a thick, damp smell of earth. The setting sun was behind her. The stone threw its own black shadow, hiding what lay beneath it. It rose until it was balanced on its lower edge, and then Freya stumbled backwards as it completed the arc, like a heavy door moving on a hinge. She sat down hard on the stony floor, and the pent-up breath sighed out of her. "I don't want to look." But it was inevitable. Curled in the rich black earth was something the size of a newborn infant. It was not a human child. Freya saw that. It was a thing begotten of far worse. The bloating of the trunk and the sickly white colour of it suggested human flesh in a state of putrefaction, but the proportions were all wrong. The head was too small, the limbs etiolated, the digits rudimentary and too few. The face was a waxen horror, the eyes mere black pinpricks, the nose and mouth fused into something like a beak. Freya saw this, and a long groan of distress oozed out of her as though she had been wounded. At the sound, the homunculus stirred. The tiny limbs waved feebly, and the pinprick eyes blinked white, and then back to black again. The beak-like mouth opened and closed. Shuddering, tears seeping from the corners of her eyes, Freya put out her hands. She looked down and saw them moving, her own hands, but she seemed to have no control over them. She lifted the homunculus from its dark bed of earth, and where it had lain, she saw the white bodies of maggots writhing away into the soil. She pressed the tiny creature to herself as a mother cradles a baby, and her lips were tight with disgust as she got to her feet and bore it away with her, over the rough stones and the grass, through the graveyard and out onto the road. The drive home was a blur. Freya was not aware of parking in her own drive, opening the door, stepping inside with the bundle she still hugged to her. Tired, so tired. Have to sleep. An alarm was ringing down in that place in her mind, but it was too faint, overwhelmed by the compulsion to lie down. Freya went into the bedroom and laid the things she had been carrying carefully down on the bed. She took off the boots, her jacket, her woolen sweater. The room was cool. It was natural to turn back the covers of the bed and lie down, the tiny bundle in her arms again held close so that she could warm it with her body. Freya looked down and saw that it was not an ugly thing as she had thought, but a real human baby, plump, bright-eyed and unblinking. The tiny hands, the fingers, the pearlescent nails, all were perfect. The soft mouth opened, beseechingly, hungrily. Freya unbuttoned the neck of her shirt and laid the child against her skin. She felt it nuzzle against her and smiled, relaxing against the pillows. Her eyes closed. The smile lingered on her lips until the tiny creature bit into her flesh, and she grimaced with pain, but did not open her eyes. Blood began to flow, but not for long. Then something flowed the other way into Freya, and an essential part of her dropped into the dark. Freya awoke to shouting, pain, a stink of something rotting. Her vision was blurred. She blinked hard, trying to clear it, and a sea of faces swam into view below her. Lean, grubby faces with avid eyes, grimaces missing teeth here and there, straggling, greasy hair. She dropped her gaze and took in clothing in an unfamiliar style, the women aproned and in ankle-length skirts, the men in long coats, everything in drab colours. The attention of every single one of them was fixed on her. She saw a kind of hungry expectation in most eyes, a sorrowing sympathy in a few. They were waiting for something to happen. Even before she looked down at herself, she knew she didn't feel right. Freya was light-boned, slender. Now she felt as though she were encased in a suit of armour. She could feel the bulk of this body, the way the great pads of fat on the chest and belly heaved with each tortuous breath, the tightness in the chest as the overburdened lungs laboured on. And it felt unstable up here. Whatever was below her feet was rickety. Wood creaked as her weight shifted. She wanted to put out her hands to hold on to something, but now she discovered that they were bound together tightly. She tried to lift them, and instead of her own delicate arms and small hands, she saw two limbs whose ham-hock thickness was not disguised by the dirty linen in which they were encased, and two large hands with bony knuckles and thick fingers terminating in spade-shaped nails. A sound like a sob escaped her. She tried to turn her head to look about her for some sign that she was dreaming, and felt the abrasion of coarse rope against the side of her neck. "Any last words, Mr. Denson?" The words were uttered close by her, roughly spoken, but not unkind. A sharp whiff of stale sweat told Freya that the man was close at her shoulder. Was he preparing to push her off into space? Terror exploded inside her. Freya wanted to speak, to protest that she was not who they thought she was. She was Freya Robertson, not Mr. Denson. A brief spurt of hope flared within her. James Denson. They think I'm James Denson. I must be dreaming. That made sense of it all, the filth, the stink, the old-fashioned clothing, the thick rope around her neck, the waiting crowd with their eager eyes. I've spent so long thinking about him, I'm having some kind of hallucination. She wanted to believe that. She wanted it so very badly. But she couldn't keep up the illusion for more than a moment. The body in which she found herself was gross and heavy. When she moved her head, the strands of hair that fell across her eyes were coarse and sandy. This was not imagination. The cool air on her skin, the murmuring voices, the creaking of the scaffold under her feet, none of that was imagination either. Any last words? So little time left to understand it. Witchcraft, they accused him of witchcraft. Did he make this happen? Dimly she wondered whether in 2021, in the narrow bed in her own cottage, the body of Freya Robertson was stirring, sitting up, looking about with a watchful curiosity. She thought it was doing exactly that, and that gentle, bookish Freya was about to undergo a personality change. James Denson had escaped. For her, there was no time left. No time to wonder how he had done it. Why her? No time for anything but last words. "I'm innocent." The voice that came out was deeper and harsher than she expected. The accent was a little strange, but then this was further away than a few hundred miles. This accent was from 300 years away. "I'm innocent," she yelled again, and now the crowd reacted with jeers. Something flew the air and exploded against the scaffold with a wet splattering sound. Faced with disbelief and taunts, Freya fell silent, and seeing this, the crowd stopped shouting too, waiting for whatever might come next in this morbid amusement. Freya was aware of the man at her shoulder, of time running out. At the very last, inspiration came. "I've done nothing, and I shall prove it. When I am dead," she faltered and then went on, "when I am dead, a white dove shall fly down and land upon this scaffold as proof of my innocence." A ripple went through the crowd again, but this time it was approval. This was a bold gesture on the part of the condemned. A greater part of the crowd looked up now with interest and rough sympathy. If these words were to come true, what a thing it would be to have seen it. Not 1 in 20 believed it would come true, of course. Freya did. She had read it, after all.